Hello everyone, I am Emma Stoyanova and today I'm going to talk about personhood and the morality of abortion. The question that I will be exploring is, when does moral life begin? This debate has been discussed by many philosophers, and today I'm going to talk about Mary Ann Warren's and John T. Noonan's arguments on abortion. But before we begin, let me explain some basic terms. The first one being abortion, which is the intentional termination of a pregnancy before the fetus can survive outside of the womb. Abortion can only be induced with chemicals or surgically. And then we have another really important term, which is embryo, which is the early development of the human in the womb, and a fetus, which is developing after the embryo stage, which is around after the 4th week. The broader debate is framed as pro-choice versus pro-life. Pro-choice supports the woman's rights and her autonomy and her decision whether she wants to end the pregnancy or continue it. And on the other hand, we have pro-lifers who believe that human lives begins at conception and therefore it must be protected. The only exception that some pro-lifers do is in extremely rare cases, for example, saving the mother's life. Now I can begin with the philosopher John T. Noonan and his article on an almost absolute value in history from 1970s. Noonan's central claim is that human life begins at conception. He believes that conception is not just a biological event, it's the moment where human life begins, and therefore we must protect it, and therefore it is morally wrong to end it. He makes 3 premises, the first one being that if an act harms a human being and it has no sufficient reason, then the act is morally wrong. The act in our case is abortion, and it harms the human conceptus, and from his point of view, a human conceptus is a human being. Noonan defends his premises by giving 3 main arguments, the first one being the argument for conception that states if you are conceived by human parents, then you are human. Noonan argues that at conception a new genetic code is created, and that's exactly where human life begins. Therefore, it is morally wrong to just end this human life. And continuing on, we have the argument for potentiality, which states that the conceptus is potentially a human being, even though it doesn't yet have experiences or feelings or thoughts and so on. We must treat it as a human being because it will in the future have all of these characteristics. Then we have the probability argument, which states that the chances of a fertilized egg developing into a human are extremely high, and therefore we must protect this human being as it will develop later in the stages into real person in the human. The only exception that he makes is when abortion is morally wrong, when it is in order to save the mother's life. There are objections to Noonan's arguments, of course, the first one being that potential doesn't equal actual. Just because something has the potential to become a person, that doesn't mean that it already has these rights of a person. Then we have the dependency argument, where Noonan states that it's the embryos or the fetuses, they are dependent of their mothers, but that doesn't mean that they don't have humanity. However, critics argue that it's not just this dependency, it's also the lack of certain characteristics, for example, feelings, thoughts, emotions, consciousness, and so on. And therefore, treating them as newborns or as babies, because they are also dependent on their mothers and they lack all of these things, it's implausible. Then we have the third objection, which is over-inclusiveness. According to Noonan, human DNA or a new genetic code is the point where human life begins. And does that mean that we can compare the moral rights of a fertilized egg to an adult human? Because that's what Noonan is saying, that human life begins at conception and therefore it has these moral rights. Continuing on, we can look at Mary Ann Warren's article on the moral and legal status of abortion from 1973. Warren, she argues that some people and philosophers, they don't understand the two meanings of the word human. She says that in a genetic sense, a human is a being from the species of Homo sapiens, and in a moral sense, human is a being which is a member from the moral society or a person with full moral rights. Warren states that fetuses and embryos, they are not persons. They are human, but they are not persons. And she argues that personhood depends on several psychological traits. The first one being consciousness and the capacity to feel pain, which basically means being able to not only feel pain, but other emotions as well, joy, sadness, and so on, and being able to think for yourself. Then we have reasoning, which is again being able to make decisions and critical thinking. And then we have self-motivated activity, which is being able, again, to think for yourself, to have consciousness. We have the capacity to communicate, where Warren says that it's not only being able to say what you want, what you desire, it's also your language, your capability to have a conversation with another person, and so on. And finally, we have self-awareness, which is being aware of your surroundings, of yourself, and your environment. And according to Warren, fetuses and embryos, they lack all of these characteristics, and they are genetically human. However, that doesn't automatically make them persons with moral rights. Warren looks at the possibility of potential persons, which are people that will in the future have moral value. However, her insight is that these potential persons' rights, they do not override the moral value of an actual person. And she says that the woman's rights will always outweigh the fetus's potential rights. Of course, there are objections to Warren's arguments as well, the first one being the exclusion problem. Warren argues that in order to be a person, you have to have certain psychological traits or characteristics. However, if that's the case, then we are excluding people with, for example, mental illnesses or disabled people and so on. And the second objection is that her arguments are too psychological. So she doesn't look at the biological events, and she doesn't consider the probability that the fetus or the embryo will develop at some point into a human or a person because of their DNA. And then we have the third objection, which is that potential personhood matters, even though she does cover some of these concepts. She doesn't really look at in depth about the potential rights and potential value that these embryos or fetuses will have in the future and their impact. In conclusion, we can say that Noonan and Warren, they completely disagree on the moral status of abortion. On one hand, we have Noonan, who believes that moral status begins at conception, and it is tightly connected to biological events and the creation of new genetic code. He also argues that moral status is connected with potential personhood, and that this matters in the case of abortion. And it is morally incorrect to end the pregnancy because embryos and fetuses, they are human beings and they have moral value. However, some of his weaknesses include that he relies too heavily on this potential, and he may give rights to beings with no consciousness. On the other hand, we have Warren, who argues that moral status is tightly connected with psychological traits, and that being a human doesn't automatically mean that you're a person. She says that abortion is permissible and is morally acceptable because fetuses and embryos are not persons. Of course, she has weaknesses as well, which include that she may exclude certain kinds of people, for example, cognitively impaired people, and also she may undervalue potential life. In my perspective, I lean towards Warren's framework, as she gives moral value to people with certain traits, and she includes people that are conscious and have thought and so on. And however, I also believe that Noonan has some arguments that are still really strong. For example, he makes the point that even if the fetus or the embryo is a potential person, we still must give it some kind of value. And I believe that abortion is permissible, and that women should decide for themselves whether they want to continue or end the pregnancy. And that was it for my presentation. Thank you for the attention. And on this slide, you can find all of my sources.